Good evening, I'm Amirul Aiman, and these are our top stories for tonight. Donald Trump warns that countries doing business with Iran could face a 25% tariff, and Greenland says it should be defended by NATO, rejects any US takeover. All that and more coming up on AWANI International. The United States is imposing a 25% tariff on any country that does business with Iran in what is seen as President Donald Trump's first action aimed at penalizing Tehran over its deadly crackdown on protesters. Trump announced the move on his social media platform, saying it takes effect immediately and applies to all relevant trade and commercial activity. He described the decision as final, but did not specify details like what counts as doing business with Iran, leaving questions over which countries and which types of trade could be affected. Iran has already been subject to extensive American sanctions for many years. Iran exports most of its oil to China. Other major trading partners include Turkey, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and India. Trump's announcement comes as he has floated U.S. military intervention in Iran. Its Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said Tehran is open to talks with Washington, but remains prepared for war. Meanwhile, Iranian officials said at least 2,000 people have reportedly been killed so far. After a nationwide crackdown, mobile phones were briefly able to call abroad, allowing several people in Tehran to speak with the Associated Press. Witnesses say the internet, however, remains cut off from the outside world. Iran is now seeing its largest anti-government demonstration in years. What began as protests over the collapse of Iran's currency has grown into a wider challenge to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's rule. Greenland says it is stepping up efforts to make sure the Arctic territory's defense stays firmly under NATO control as its government once again rejects any suggestion of a takeover by the United States. The statement comes after President Donald Trump says the US must own Greenland to prevent possible Russian or Chinese expansion in the region. Greenland's government stressed that all NATO member states, including the US, share a common responsibility for the island's defense and security, adding that as part of the Danish kingdom, Greenland is a NATO member and must be defended through NATO structures. Meanwhile, a bipartisan group of US lawmakers is set to visit Denmark this week. The visit comes as US Congress moves to challenge or support Trump's push to seize the strategic Arctic territory. Trump has said a US military presence on the island is not enough and has refused to rule out using force. That's the headline for tonight. More news coming up shortly after the break.
Ketegangan memuncak buat para penyokong. Derby Manchester. Satu persaingan abadi.
Oh, they did it!
Di mana kedua pasukan enggan mengalah.
What a phenomenal match this has been!
Adakah biru atau merah kali ini? Premier League. Inilah one for the fans. Secara langsung dan eksklusif di Astro.
Welcome back. The US State Department says it has revoked more than 100,000 visas since President Donald Trump returned to office last year, marking a 150% increase from 2024. The move is part of a broader crackdown on immigration, including the deportation of migrants, some of whom held valid visas.
The revoked visas include roughly 8,000 student visas and 2,500 special visas for individuals with past encounters with U.S. law enforcement. Authorities said the main reasons for revocation are overstaying, driving under the influence, assault and theft. Since returning to the White House, Trump has also tightened visa vetting procedures, including plans to more extensively screen visitors' social media activity before approving entry. Separately, the Department of Homeland Security said more than 600,000 people were deported during the same period, while a further 2.5 million left the country voluntarily.
Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum has ruled out any U.S. strikes on her country following a phone call with President Donald Trump. It comes after Trump warned that the U.S. would start targeting drug cartels on Mexican soil.
Sheinbaum said she made clear that armed intervention inside Mexico was not acceptable and that she rejected any suggestion of U.S. military action on Mexican territory. The call with Trump, she said, focused on security, highlighting progress made by Mexican authorities, including a 50% drop in fentanyl trafficking into the United States over the past year. She also confirmed that senior officials from both countries will meet again on January 22nd to discuss bilateral security issues. It wasn't the first time Trump made the threat against Mexico, but the U.S.'s recent attack and capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro has added new weight to his statement.
Taiwan says it has reached a broad consensus with the United States in ongoing tariff talks, with both sides now discussing a timetable to finalize an agreement. Taiwan is seeking to cut tariffs on its exports to the U.S. to 15% from the current 20%, a goal it first set out late last year.
Reuters reported that Taipei indicates a deal announcement could come by the end of January. While reports in the U.S. media said the Trump administration is nearing an agreement that would lower Taiwan's tariff rate, while also pressing chipmaker TSMC to commit to building at least 5 additional facilities in Arizona. Taiwan, a major global semiconductor hub, has said its offer to Washington includes cooperation on replicating its technology clusters around science parks. TSMC declined to comment on any further U.S. investment beyond the $165 billion it has already pledged. As of now, Taiwan's chips are not subjected to any U.S. tariffs.
G7 and other economies have met in Washington to discuss reducing dependence on China for rare earths and critical minerals. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent hosted the talks as China's recent export controls heighten pressures on global markets.
Finance ministers from the G7, along with officials from Australia, India, Mexico and South Korea, discussed ways to build alternative supplies of rare earths and other strategic minerals. Options included setting a minimum price floor, creating new partnerships, and using public finance, tax incentives, and trade measures to support non-Chinese supply chains. Japan said there was a broad agreement on the need to quickly reduce reliance on China, while Germany cautioned against forming an anti-China bloc, saying Europe must move faster to develop its own resources. The move comes amid rising concerns over supply chain security. China currently dominates the global supply chain for critical minerals, refining large shares of rare earths, lithium, cobalt, and graphite, materials essential for defense, semiconductors, and renewable energy.
China is stepping up efforts to use its vast coal reserves to produce plastics and synthetic rubber. Beijing has reportedly approved more than 30 projects to manufacture these key raw materials in a bid to reduce its reliance on imported oil.
Of the total, 20 projects are already operational, with combined annual capacity exceeding 24 million tons. The facilities are located mainly in coal-rich regions such as Shaanxi and Inner Mongolia. Coal can be processed into olefins, an essential input for tens of thousands of chemical products, including plastics, synthetic fibers, and rubber. Beijing's move to use coal could deliver significant cost savings and help cut dependence on imported fuel, at a time when U.S. President Donald Trump is seeking to expand American influence over global oil supplies.
The U.S. states of Minnesota and Illinois have sued Donald Trump's administration in a bid to block a federal search of federal immigration agents into their states. The lawsuits argue that the deployments amount to an unconstitutional federal invasion.
In Minnesota, officials accused the administration of racially profiling residents and targeting the state due to its Democratic leanings. State officials said they would ask the court to impose a temporary restraining order on the federal deployment later on Tuesday, when a hearing is scheduled. Illinois, meanwhile, is seeking a court order to block U.S. Customs and Border Protection from conducting civil immigration enforcement in the state, while also moving to curb tactics such as the use of tear gas. The legal challenges follow the fatal shooting of a woman in Minnesota by an immigration agent last week. But the Trump administration has described the lawsuits as baseless, saying agents were targeting undocumented migrants and that additional backup was needed to ensure their safety during operations.
The United Nations interim force in Lebanon says an Israeli tank fired near its peacekeepers in southern Lebanon on Monday. UN officials warn incidents like this are becoming more frequent, raising serious concerns about the safety of their personnel.
UNIFIL said it has repeatedly reported Israeli attacks either near or directed at its troops in recent months. Less than 2 weeks ago, gunfire from Israeli positions landed close to peacekeepers on 2 separate occasions. UNIFIL described the latest incident as a serious violation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, which underpins the current truce along the border. UNIFIL has operated in the region for decades, serving as a buffer between Israel and Lebanon while coordinating with the Lebanese army. More recently, the force has worked closely with Lebanon's military to help maintain a year-old ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah.
The Malaysian Communications and Multimedia Commission is considering legal action against social media platform X after its AI application Grok failed to comply with online safety laws. Communications Minister Datuk Fahmi Fazil says the move follows inadequate responses from X to MCMC's queries on Grok's abilities to generate manipulated and sexually explicit images.
Pihak X telah memberi maklum balas, tapi maklum balas ini sangat tidak memadai. Dia adalah basically kenyataan pro forma. Jadi itu telah setelah saya mendapat maklum balas daripada pihak MCMC, saya mengarahkan supaya dikenakan sekatan sementara, dipanggil untuk berbincang, tapi kita akan pertimbangkan juga tindakan perundangan.
The duration of the restriction, said Fahmi, will depend on X's level of compliance with Malaysian law. He added that it involved breaches to the Communications and Multimedia Act as well as the Online Safety Act.
Indonesia's President Prabowo Subianto has reiterated his commitment to a $32 billion project to build the country's new capital city, Nusantara. It comes as he made his first overnight stay there as president.
Questions over the future of the Nusantara capital project have lingered since Prabowo took office in October 2024. The project is a legacy of his predecessor, Joko Widodo, better known as Jokowi, who announced the plan in 2019 to move the capital 1,200 kilometers from the overcrowded and sinking Jakarta. Widodo had missed his target of relocating the government by the end of his second and final term in 2024. It was because construction of the city in a remote southeastern part of Borneo Island began in 2022 after pandemic-related delays. Last year, Prabowo approved a budget of about $2.89 billion for the project through 2029, around 60% of what Widodo spent between 2022 and 2024. The project is now targeting completion by 2028 for buildings housing the legislative and judicial branches of government.
That concludes AWANI International for tonight. Stay with us as we track the strategies and power shifts shaping the new global order. For more updates, visit international.astroawani.com and follow us on social media. I'm Amirul Aiman. Thank you for watching. Good night.